Corey Atwood here from Bago Games. I'm here live at PAX East 2017. I just checked out The Church in the Darkness from Paranoid Productions. I'm here speaking with Richard about the game. How's your PAX so far?
Well, it just started like 5 minutes ago, right? It feels like it. I mean, I've been at the booth showing the game to people. That's been going really well, but it kind of makes time fly by because I get really into the people playing it, and then I'm like, oh wait, it's 2 o'clock. What happened? So it's crazy.
So tell me about Church in the Darkness.
Sure. So Church in the Darkness is a top-down action infiltration game, but it's set inside a religious cult in the 1970s. So you're trying to infiltrate the group to try to find your nephew Alex, because he's down there. They've moved to South America to isolate themselves from the corrupt American government that they hate. And you're trying to find Alex to see if he's safe. Does he want to stay there? Are they forcing him to stay there? And then you can, choose what you do based on what you find. Because every time you play the game, it's a roguelike, so it's got like permadeath. It's got some other roguelike elements to it, like randomization of the content and stuff like that, but also the narrative changes every time. So you don't know if the cult group if they're just sort of radical separatists who want to go live and have their socialist utopia, or if they're actually apocalyptic doomsday people who are eventually going to do something really bad. So you're trying to figure that out and decide if Alex is safe there or not.
So what else is procedurally generated? Are like the maps procedurally generated and the people you encounter as well?
Yeah, so like every time you start the game, you start in a totally different part of the map. You started, like your objectives move around, where the guards are, where the resources are change. Like the overall structure of the map is the same, but all the elements in it move around, and that gives you a lot of variety in addition to like the narrative stuff we talked about.
So how long, I know it's procedurally generated, so it probably changes, but how long is like the average playthrough, would you say?
Right. I find it really varies a lot depending on the player, because some people play super fast and can get a lot done. Others play very cautiously, because you do have limited resources in the game, so it's not something where you're just going to murder a bunch of people in the camp willy-nilly. You got to play more carefully. So we're estimating that a single playthrough will be like 2 to 4 hours. And then you can get like a ton of different endings because of all the different narrative versions. And you can play the whole game lethally or non-lethally. You can choose to kill certain characters or not kill them. And then that can lead to repercussions in the type of ending you get. So it's designed to be like meaty enough that 2 to 4 hours feels like a real thing, but not so long that you don't want to replay it. So we really want people to go back, see the other versions of the cult.
How many endings are we talking about?
Well, it's at least like 10 substantial ones, but there's like tons of little variations you can get depending on the choices you make. So like, definitely more than 20 like total. And we're not even quite done with all of them yet. So there's quite a bit of variety you can get in the endings.
Now, I know there's a lot of stealth in the game. Can you just flat out like join the cult and become like a mole, or how does that work?
We're experimenting with some of the endings where you can actually join up, but it is a game of action infiltration. So it's not like a cult simulator where you're like managing your cult, or it's not like a pacifist adventure game where you're just talking with everybody. It's still an action game. So it's not, they never welcome you with open arms at the beginning, but after you've been there a while, there might be scenarios in some of the endings where you choose to stay. But, we're not talking about too much of that just yet.
Now, it's pretty apparent you guys have drawn on some real life things. This happens in the 70s. There's a lot of Jonestown things that are reminiscent. What else did you guys draw from?
Yeah, I found the 70s in general to be a fascinating decade because, it's coming out of the 60s where it was sort of peace, love, and happiness is going to save the world. And so the radical sort of progressive side of things is kind of burned out on that by the 70s. They realize that's not really working, and people are joining more extreme groups like the People's Temple, or there was another cult group in Oregon called Rajneeshpuram. It was very, South Asian influenced. Or there was one in LA called the Source Family that was like a health food group that sort of got bigger and bigger and eventually moved to a compound in Hawaii. And like some of these groups, end really tragically, like Jonestown did. Others do some illegal things and eventually disband. Others just break up because they try something for a while and it doesn't work out. And I wanted to explore how these different groups, work in different situations. So that's part of where the changing narrative comes in. Because people always look back on these groups and say, why didn't we know? Why didn't we stop it? But it's really hard to know from the outside. Like people just deciding to go live in the jungle, shouldn't, if they want to do that, they should go do that as long as they're not hurting anyone and they're not hurting themselves, right? But it's hard to know before something tragic happens that it's going to happen. So this is kind of about trying to figure that out while you're there.
So how do the lives work? I know you mentioned roguelike. So when you get caught, is the jig up, you're dead, game over, you have to start again? Or is it like you get a second chance. I saw something on a trailer about how you're like put in a cage or something like that.
Exactly. You can if you get taken down, they'll lock you up a couple of times, so you get a couple of chances that way. But if you've been playing as like a murderer, if you've just been killing tons of people, they found the bodies, they're just going to kill you right away. So you sort of lose your extra lives, if you've been playing more, more homicidally, right? Which is like, we want to give the player choices about how they want to approach this group and what they want to do. And you can finish the game using whatever method you want to, but they're not going to necessarily give you a second chance if you've killed all their friends.
Yeah, that's kind of burning bridges, I guess.
Exactly.
Now, what made you want to put it in the 70s as opposed to today? Because I know that today there are still cults, granted not as much, and it's also a very tumultuous time, politically speaking. So is anything that's happening today reflected in the game, or is it pretty much just set in the 70s?
I mean, 70s was, again, I think these people joining these different groups, they still wanted to change the world. They still had this hope, right, of thinking, well, what we did in the 60s didn't work out necessarily, and there's the Vietnam War is sort of people getting really disillusioned with government at that point. And so they start joining these different groups, but it's still thinking they're going to save the world. Like, these different groups all thought they were going to do something good. And after that, like, I feel like starting in the 80s, people kind of gave up on that kind of hope. They're just like, no, I'm just gonna get rich, it's me and mine or whatever, or I'm gonna try to work within the system or something. I'm not gonna try to go to these other groups, because people then got kind of disillusioned with that working as well. And it turns out it's really hard to build a socialist utopia in the jungle, right? It's not easy. So the type of radicalism that led to these groups being more common, I think it doesn't happen so much anymore. I'm also just fascinated by historical settings, right? That we don't have enough period pieces that are like set in real, everything we're doing in the game is trying to be based on reality. And I feel like that's in some ways easier to do it in a setting like the 70s versus now, where we don't really understand the present in the present, right? We understand it better like 20 years later. So I think as a storyteller, I just found that more interesting to work with.
And lastly, it's a very sensitive subject, especially when things end badly, like you see on the news. What made you guys want to tackle a subject like this? It's not something that's tackled in video games very often.
Right.
And does anybody involved in the development process have any personal experience with like a family member or a loved one or anything being involved with a cult like this?
Yeah, I mean, well, I got there's a few questions there, I guess. I just thought it was a fascinating subject, and that telling it in a game form, you can look at those different sides of it. Like, if we were going to make a movie about a cult or something, you're going to tell one story about that cult. Here we're sort of telling multiple stories, trying to see the different sides. So I thought that was really cool. I also like games tackling subject matter that is challenging and that is a little upsetting maybe, just because it's, too often I think, there's lots of games where you can play as a space marine, or lots of games where you can kill a lot of orcs, and that's great. I like those games too. But it's cool to see games branching out into other spaces that are a little more serious. And certainly there'll be people who are like, oh, games shouldn't talk about that. But I think it's just like film 50 years ago, people are like, oh, you shouldn't make a film about rape, or you shouldn't make a film about, religion or whatever. And over time, we realize film is a fully realized artistic medium, and they can make movies about whatever they want now. And I think games are that same thing, where it's growing up to try to tackle these different subjects. So no one on the team has been in like a total isolationist cult, but it's interesting, like working at big tech companies, they're kind of cults as well. You look at like a Steve Jobs or something, right? Like, very inspirational leader, but someone who really stopped, people would follow him wherever he was going, and they would sort of suspend their own critical thinking to say, well, Steve says we need to do this, we're going to do this, and that worked out okay, because Steve Jobs, was just trying to make really cool technology products. Right?
He wasn't a socialist in the jungle.
Right, he wasn't trying to kill anybody, he wasn't arming the Apple staff or anything, but he was kind of a cult leader. So I found it, I've been in situations like that where there is like a really charismatic figure where people are like, right, I'll just follow that guy. And that's sort of where you can get in trouble, when that person starts abusing that power, right? So there's lots of analogies to things that I've gone through where I feel like this person had a real cult of personality. But yeah, not as directly as we have in the game here.
And lastly, so what platforms will we be able to play it on, and when is it going to be available?
Yeah, so it's going to be on Steam for PC and Mac, and also PlayStation and Xbox, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. We're just sorting out our ship date right now. We're looking at 2017, but we're on indie time here a little bit, so that might be a little bit fungible, but we're doing our best to get it done as soon as possible.
And any idea for a price point?
Not anything we've announced, but if you look at indie games in the world, it's not going to be a $60 game or something like that. It's definitely in that sort of indie Steam game price range. So,
All right, cool. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
thanks. Great to talk to you.